Good morning, everybody, and welcome this morning not to St Mary's Vicarage, but St Mary's Church. Here we are inside our beautiful church of Handley, and I'm here on the south side of the church, Morning Sally, by our this family tomb here, which we also use as our little prayer station here. You can come into the church at any time during the day, morning Michelle, and you can light a candle and write a prayer to put on the prayer board, which I remember in my daily prayers, and just spend some time in stillness and silence here. Morning Mary, morning Bill. And it's lovely that our churches are able to be open again, though I know many churches, rural churches, are struggling to reopen and implement the procedures required because of the COVID crisis. But thankfully, St Mary's is open, and it's normally open at the moment from around about sort of 10 o'clock through to about 5 p.m. So we're very lucky in our beautiful village and in many, many villages to have the parish church, and I'm a great supporter of having our churches open. The church, the village church, is here for all the people in the village. It's not just here for the churchgoers, it's the parish church, it's the community building. And in a sense, all of us should be able to come into this sacred space, to this place of spiritual refreshment, a spiritual oasis in our world. And whatever your particular religious persuasion or leaning may be, even if you're not a committed churchgoer, you can still come into this space and just be still. Now, yesterday I was rummaging around in our potting shed trying to find something, and normally when you're trying to find something in your potting shed, you find something else that you didn't expect to find but can't find the thing you were looking for. And that's exactly what happened to me yesterday. And what I found was a little table fountain. It was something I've used in the past when I've been developing prayer spaces and such like, and worship places. And I suddenly thought to myself, that'll be brilliant in the church. So I gave it a good old clean up, and I brought it over here, and it's now sitting over here by where we light our candles. If I'm still for a moment, you might better hear it trickle away. That sound of slow running water just trickling away reminds me of the way that in the Old Testament, when the Israelites complained that they were dying of thirst, that Moses smote the rock and God provided them with living water from the rock. It reminds me also that we begin our Christian journey in water through baptism. And it reminds me also of the encounter of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well, where Jesus asks for a drink to be refreshed. And then in the conversation that Jesus has with the Samaritan woman, he says to her that those who come to him will never be thirsty again. So that sound of water is a reminder of the spiritual refreshment we can receive through Jesus. So wherever you may be today, for those who live in Handley or roundabouts, please do use your parish church. The restrictions are in place, but they're very simple. All you need to do is squirt your hands with hand sanitizer on your way in and your way out, and just sit in the pews that are marked, and don't go into the area of the church that's roped off. But it's still a wonderful place to come and sit and be, and just be spiritually refreshed, just to spend some time in stillness and silence with God. Feel free to light a candle or to write a prayer and pin it on the prayer board. In these times of trial, of uncertainty, that stillness and coming to God becomes even more important to us. And on these hot summer days that hopefully we'll be having, there is something wonderful about walking into the coolness of a church. And our church here, because we don't have stained glass windows like many other medieval churches, the light that comes into this building is absolutely fantastic. So do make the most of your parish churches, wherever they may be, as a place of prayer and stillness a spiritual oasis for us all. Now, today, Wednesday, the 22nd of July, is a great feast day in the church, and we remember one of my favourite saints, because today is the feast day of Mary Magdalene. Now, in one of my previous parish churches, St Andrew's, Shrivenham, we had a side chapel dedicated to Mary Magdalene, and that's probably because the original dedication of that church in Shrivenham was to Mary Magdalene, but the side chapel remained. Let me just read you a little bit here from this book, Exciting Holiness, the Anglican Book of Saints. All four Gospels give Mary Magdalene a unique place among Jesus' followers. Probably from Magdala by the Sea of Galilee, she is described as having been healed by Jesus before accompanying him during his ministry. Along with faithful women, she stayed beside the cross during the crucifixion and was the first disciple to discover the empty tomb on Easter morning. She was privileged with the first appearance of the risen Lord, who sent her to take the good news of the resurrection to the other disciples. This commission earned her the title Apostle to the Apostles in the early church. I love the story of Mary Magdalene, and through history she's been much confused. She's sadly for many centuries been mislined as a woman of ill repute, but actually that wasn't the case at all. And indeed the Roman Catholic Church a few years back did issue an edict saying that that was incorrect. Mary Magdalene was healed by Jesus, and she was a follower of the disciples throughout. In fact, when in the Acts of the Apostles, the disciples decide they have to elect a new apostle, a new disciple, because of what has happened with Judas Iscariot, the criteria that they lay out for being a disciple, Mary Magdalene fills all of that criteria. Unfortunately, of course, back then, the issues of her being a woman were a bit more intense than they are today. But she would have fulfilled that criteria. And just because, in a sense, she wasn't one of the 12, she was very much one of Jesus' disciples. And there are records of her going off on her own missionary journeys and spreading the good news of the gospel after Jesus' death and resurrection. She was probably a woman of quite some means, because there's no mention of her being married or having a husband, so she didn't rely on a man, in a sense, for her income. And in fact, she probably supported the disciples financially with Jesus over their 3 years of mission. She linked to the woman that was healed of hemorrhages, and in that gospel account we hear that she had spent a lot of money on all the medical treatments available at the time. So maybe Mary Magdalene was actually a woman of some means who was able to offer financial support to the mission work of the disciples. She clearly had a very close relationship with Jesus, but despite Dan Brown's many protestations, was never married to him. If she had been married to him, there would have been no point in hiding it or denying it. In fact, it's probably quite odd the other way round, because in those days, if you were a religious figure or a rabbi or a teacher, the idea was to be married and to have many, many children, because that was a sign that you were blessed from God. But Jesus wasn't in the position of being married, because he knew what his particular role and mission in life was. And to have left a woman and children and to have died on the cross would have not been a fair thing to do. But Mary is a wonderful figure and a wonderful character. And I'm just going to read the gospel passage that's set for Mary Magdalene. Of course, it's one of the gospel passages for Easter Day as well. So this is the gospel from the gospel according to John, chapter 20, beginning to read at verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the tomb. She ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she bent over and looked into the tomb. And she saw 2 angels in white sitting there where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. This is the gospel of the Lord. It's a beautiful passage and a wonderful encounter on that first Easter morn. And what's so special about it, apart from obviously the resurrection, is the intimacy in what is going on there. Yesterday and over the past couple of broadcasts, I've spoken to you about the wonderful thing that Jesus offers us in a relationship with God. This very personal relationship with God, a relationship where we don't have to go through rigmaroles of ritual or rules in order to have a relationship with the living God. Jesus encourages us to call God Abba, Father, Daddy, in other words, as I said yesterday. And here, in a sense, we see like the final stamp and seal of how these new relationships are going to be. Mary, distraught because she has lost her friend and teacher and master, comes to the tomb only to find the grave is empty. She thinks it's probably been robbed or the body's been removed by the Roman authorities. She sees the angels, but that doesn't seem to sort of register with her. And maybe that's because of her grief. If you've ever sat with somebody who's completely wrapped up and completely lost in grief, you can see why she didn't necessarily register what was going on. But she turns around and there is Jesus, and she fails to recognise him. I think this is twofold, partly as of what I've said in a sense, her grief, but also in the fact, of course, what Mary is witnessing is not a resuscitated body, but is the resurrection. Is Jesus transformed as we will be? The disciples on the mountain at the Transfiguration, they got a bit of a glimpse of what this would be like. And Jesus isn't some sort of zombie walking around. He's been reclothed in his resurrected body, the promise that we will all have that too, which is just as well because I've put on several pounds over this lockdown. But what's so special is that Jesus calls Mary by name. He says to her, "Mary, Mary." And when he utters those words, Mary's heart jumps, because suddenly in that very familiar, that very personal calling, she remembers and realises who Jesus is, who this person is standing in front of her. Her response, of course, is respectful. She says, "Rabboni," teacher. But here again, we have to understand that if as a Christian you believe that Jesus is the living God, that the risen Jesus is the God of all eternity, the God that flung stars into space, the God that spoke the word, let there be light. Here in front of Mary is God. And what does God do? He simply says, "Mary." He says your name, like Peter or John or Lynn or Sue. It's that personal. No wonder Mary wants to embrace Jesus, and art has an odd thing with this because of, in a sense, the early or medieval church struggling with this idea. They're very reluctant for anybody to be touching Jesus. But Jesus' ministry was filled with touch, so I don't believe it would have stopped here. Mary flings his arms around Jesus, and Jesus says these words which can seem a bit harsh: do not hold on to me. He's not saying do not touch me. What he's actually saying is don't hold on to the earthly me. Something is happening here. Mary wants to, in a sense, sort of stick Jesus to the ground. Back, he's not dead, don't go. But of course, all through Jesus, his vision has been looking ahead to the wonderful gift that God was going to give to all of us, to the new kingdom he was established. What Jesus is gently saying to Mary is that she needs to let go of the earthly Jesus, the Jesus that she has come to know over the past 3 years, because she's going to get to know a new Jesus, the kingly Jesus, the divine Jesus, the Jesus who is enthroned in heaven. But despite all of that grandeur that I've just mentioned, the Jesus that still calls her Mary, and the Jesus that says, call me Father, Daddy, Abba, that personal relationship. That's what I love about this Bible passage and this resurrection story. It's the intimacy between the two of them. I'm sure we can think about friendships that we have like that, both male and female, with friends that we have, that specialness that we have. And that's what God is saying we can have with him. We don't have to have this distant relationship of sort of images of God on a throne with a white beard up in a cloud. God walks with us and is with us, has his hand on our shoulder, and is our friend on the pilgrim journey. That's why this story, I just think, is so lovely. So today, the feast day of Mary Magdalene, something to rejoice in, that God invites us into these very special and personal relationships. Anyhow, what am I up to for the rest of the day? Well, a bit later on this afternoon, got to do some admin and all of that sort of stuff. I'm going to be attending a very interesting Zoom meeting, which is our diocesan breakfast church hub. Now, towards the end of last year in September, we launched our own breakfast church here in St Mary's. We took our fabulous service that we had, that's led by Jackie and Naomi and Mark and others, the informal service, and we modified it a little bit and we added breakfast to it. And it was really taking off. It was wonderful to come into the church at about 9 o'clock, get our bacon and sausage sandwiches, have some coffee and chat, and then gather for worship. Unfortunately, of course, like everything else with COVID, once that kicked in, all church stopped. And even though now we're able to have services in a limited way, of course, breakfast church is very, very challenging, simply because at the moment we're not allowed to serve food or beverages in church unless it's a properly organised cafe. So it means that a lot of the wonderful initiative and mission work that was going on in churches around the country, in particular in this diocese and in our rural churches, which I have a particular concern for, has in a sense been hold. Some churches have been very innovative and they've sort of been doing breakfast church online. In other words, make your own bacon butty and sit in front of your computer. And that's great, but it's not really as good as us being together collegiately. Remember what I've just said about God invites us into particular and special friendships. And yesterday I talked about the family of the church. They haven't been able to do that. So I'm looking forward to this Zoom meeting, webinar or seminar this afternoon, where we're going to share some ideas and just think about how we can be and hold breakfast churches under the restrictions that we have, and in the hope that as we move towards September, those restrictions will be eased again, so that we can start those services up. Because despite the fact that the statistics, the traditional statistics, say that the church is in terminal decline, that is true to a certain extent. Traditional forms of worship are in decline. But what a lot of these statistics don't measure or haven't measured till recently are new forms of worship, or what we tend to call new worshipping initiatives. These are different ways of being church. Breakfast church is one of them. family type services, different ways of gathering people together and worshipping. Once a year, the church wardens and incumbents, we have to fill out forms to say how many people have come to church. But in a sense, those statistics have only measured the sort of very traditional services that churches have tended to do. Holy Communion or matins or morning worship or evening prayer. Until very recently, we haven't been actually measuring these more modern types of worship, or worship that's done in a very different way, worship that's actually not even done in a church. But some of the surveys of what sometimes gets called new worship initiatives, or sometimes, has shown growing with huge numbers of people getting involved. So in a sense, that's the trouble with statistics. They can tell you one thing, but they can only tell you what questions you ask them. And if you're only measuring the traditional forms of church, then yes, it does look like the church is dying on its feet. But if you broaden the net, and let's remember, Jesus told the disciples to cast the net on the other side and look at the hall they pulled in. When we look at how the nets are being cast in different ways on the other side of the boat, indeed we can see there is a big haul coming in. So it's really important that we look at how we can, in a sense, begin again these new ways of being church and these new ways of worshipping and reaching out to people, which will move the church from decline to stability and to growth. So I'm really looking forward to that this afternoon. In between all of that, I'm going to wash my car as well, hopefully. But we'll get that in some point. Anyhow, thanks for being with me this morning. Just a reminder, tomorrow, of course, is Thursday. We'll have our daily broadcast at 10 o'clock. Then there's the Magnificafe Zoom coffee morning. The link for that goes out. And of course, tomorrow evening, we have our next session of the Wisdom House, where we'll be looking at the theme of forgiveness. If you haven't been able to join us for the other sessions, it doesn't matter. Feel free to join us tomorrow evening. The link will go out with tomorrow morning's YouTube link and the Magnificafe Zoom link. And I hope that those of you who want to join us, we've had some really interesting discussions over the past few weeks. 7:30 tomorrow evening. Just looking ahead to Sunday, our service on Sunday will be online, but I'm toying with the idea, depending on what the weather is, of maybe having a sort of an open air service, a gathering, either in the church or maybe on the front lawn of the vicarage. And we're probably going to use the Celtic form of morning worship. Though, of course, if we are gathered together, unfortunately, we won't be able to sing. But hey-ho, I'm hoping that will change too. Anyhow, thanks for being with me this morning in our beautiful church of St Mary's. And please, do come up here and enjoy the peace and tranquility that the church offers. It's open every day from about 10 through to 5 o'clock. Come here and be at peace and engage in that personal relationship that Jesus invites us to have with the living God. Let's just close with the grace. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. Thanks for being with us today. Enjoy the day. It's beautiful and sunny outside. God bless.